everybody. Thank you for being here today. I'm really excited to be here, and my cohort, Ms. Somi McDowell up here, we traveled together and we're really enjoying the cool weather. I know you guys are probably dreading it because it's all cloudy and gray, but it almost hit 100 degrees in Fahrenheit the other day in Tucson, so we don't like that so much this early in the year. So we're kind of out there with coats, no coats on, and short sleeves. So if you see us wandering and we look a little bonkers, we're just enjoying your cool weather. So good to be here this morning. We're going to be talking about trauma, but we're not going to stop there. We're actually going to talk about the concept of trauma and resilience and what it means to recover. People do recover from trauma. I found in our work that about 90% of the people we see have a history of trauma. Not everyone that comes through our doors understands that they have trauma. A lot of people tend to minimize or have questions about their experiences. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the road to healing from trauma and what that looks like. But we're going to start just with some basics, what I know. So in the desert where we're from, we have a monsoon season. Isn't this lovely? I captured this from my backyard with my iPhone. We have monsoon storms that come, and we start a day that's clear and cloudless, and which you guys might not see too often. and then we might end up with something like this moving our way. What I like about this image is that there's some beauty in it, and it's also very fierce. Trauma is a storm. It's a storm that comes unexpected and unannounced in people's lives. Sometimes the storm stays for a really long time, wreaking havoc and destroying much of the landscape. Sometimes it's brief and horrific, but there's also beauty in the storm, and sometimes we can't appreciate it until that storm's at a distance. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I get this question a lot. I'm just curious, how many of you guys work with trauma survivors? Can I just see your hands right now? Okay, great, thank you. Do you get this question a lot? Well, what is trauma? I don't know if I have trauma or not. What is trauma? So this definition kind of comes from our diagnostic and statistical manual that we refer to in the US. So 3 components: experiencing, witnessing, or being confronted by. Those are the 3 pieces. Events that cause intense fear, helplessness, horror, right? Threat of death, actual death, injury, sexual violation, threats to someone's safety or wellness. Now if we stopped there, a lot of people would say, well, what happened to me doesn't really look like trauma. This last part is really important. It's really crucial to how we understand trauma. Threats to our integrity. So when I think about integrity, what I consider is my integrity means that I get to choose for myself how I participate and what goes on around me. When I make choices about what I'm participating in, I choose based on my values, my morals, right? My sense of what's right or wrong. When people are traumatized, they lose that choice. Right? They don't get to choose how they participate in what's going on around them. And so frequently, the traumatic event is a violation of their boundaries, their morals, their values, their sense of what's okay or not okay. And so that threat to integrity really speaks to that violation at that deeper level. And that violation, unfortunately, is what causes so much damage underneath for people. So understanding that definition more fully is really important. I might carry this with me so I don't have to keep stumbling around. A lot of people get messages about trauma, well, from well-meaning people in their lives, right? And maybe we've said this to people in our lives too, when they've shared their story again, or they're stuck in their story somewhere. It's time to move on, it wasn't a big deal. Worse things happen to people, you need to get over it, stop feeling sorry for yourself. So those are messages that people frequently hear, the feedback that they hear. I saw a statistic once that says that the average trauma survivor needs to tell their story about 50 times before they begin the process of recovery. I tried to find that statistic again recently, and I couldn't. What I found instead suggests that the trauma survivor needs to tell their story again and again and again. There's no limits. So what happens when people are traumatized is that they lock down that story, and they tuck it away. They don't talk about it, they don't look about it, at it. They try not to let it into their minds. And unfortunately, it's like a barrel of poison that's buried under the ground and starts to erode the soil, right? Starts to seep out, it starts to poison things. people can't just move on from trauma. Right? Because trauma is a whole body experience. All the research, if we look at it across the board, suggests that. So what we know is that trauma alters our neurochemistry. Traumatic events change things. So a couple examples of that is that what we know is that people who have PTSD tend to have lower levels of serotonin in their brain than people who don't have PTSD. So if we think about what serotonin does for us, right? It helps with our mood, with our sleep, with our appetite, with our libido. So people with lower serotonin tend to have issues with depression, with anxiety, sleep disturbances. What we also know is that people who have, particularly children who have trauma, tend to have issues with aggression, tend to have issues with impulsivity, related to some of those neurochemical changes. People with trauma also tend to operate either in a state of hyperarousal, aware of everything going on around them, jumping at every noise, or they tend to have issues with hypoarousal, where they're numb, they're walking through life in a haze, and they don't respond well to events that are around them. And unfortunately, as a result, they're often re-traumatized because they're in scenarios where they're not paying attention to the cues that something's dangerous or out of whack. We also know that people with trauma tend to have issues with affect dysregulation, mood dysregulation. Right? We tend to see that with people who have diagnoses of personality disorders, right? Typically borderline personality disorder. We see a lot of that. People have changes in the way they think. Messages they tell themselves. I'm broken, something's wrong with me, what happened to me was my fault, I deserved it, somehow I should have done something different, resulting in a lot of shame, damage to their self-esteem. Right? We talked earlier about the threats to integrity, and so when someone has trauma, it really threatens their core values, so they don't know what's right or wrong often. They end up engaging in behavior later that really is different from who they are on the inside. We see people with trauma having trouble trusting and engaging. And that makes sense, right? Because when people have trauma, they've often been violated by someone they trust. So how then can they trust in the future? How can they trust themselves? We know that people with PTSD also have very high levels of other co-occurring disorders, particularly substance use disorders. So we know that to be true. What we also know about trauma is that trauma is encoded in the brain differently. It's encoded in terms of sensory data. So that often later people are triggered by sensory pieces in their environment. Our normal everyday events are encoded differently. They're encoded as a narrative. So we have words and stories for them. Right? We can tell them from point A to point B to point C in a linear fashion. So if you think about your story of getting up this morning, how many are here from out of town? You staying in a hotel, right? So if you think about getting up in the morning and what you did, and it makes sense, right? You can tell it in a story. Trauma doesn't make sense. So people often have very jumbled recollections of what happened, patches of a lack of memory, where things are fuzzy. They can't put it together. And sometimes what's jumbled up in the recall are sensory pieces. I remember a smell. I remember a feeling on my skin. I remember a certain color. And when trauma occurs during younger years, it's really, really difficult. People are often stalled out during that time. Children, when they're little, are very egocentric, right? So I have a little boy at home, he's 9. He's the apple of my eye. He's my only, so he's a little spoiled, I'm sure. Although he probably would admit to that. Guess what his favorite store in the world is? Any guesses? Do you guys have here Toys R Us? Yes. Okay. So he's egocentric, and it's beautiful, because if I come home from the store and I have a Toys R Us bag in my hand, what do you think he's going to ask me?
What did you buy?
What did you buy me from Toys R Us? Right? Because I'm his mom, I have his favorite bag in my hand from his favorite store, and I'm in his house, right? So that must be for him. That's beautiful, okay? That's what a perfect picture of egocentricity is. When it's not so beautiful is when a child begins to believe that their father's drinking and beating up their mother happens because of something that they did. some fault of theirs, some way that they could have prevented that from happening. That's how egocentricity backfires with trauma. So we have to always keep that in mind, where those negative self-concepts come from when we're talking about traumatic memory, what those developmental pieces are. And when people are traumatized, there's often formation of a neural pathway that connects the sensory piece that might have been formerly benign, like the color yellow or the smell of flowers in the air, to an emotion that's really intense and painful. I'm a reader. Right, I like to read. This is a quote from The Kite Runner. Anyone read The Kite Runner? Okay, difficult book to read. Lots of trauma in that book. But if we really pay attention to the sensory pieces in this quote, it's stunning when you think about trauma and the sensory recall. He says, "I became what I am today at the age of 12 on a frigid, overcast day in the winter of 1975. I remember the precise moment. Crouching behind a crumbling wall, peeking into the alley near the frozen creek. That was a long time ago, but it is wrong what they say about the past, I've learned, about how you can bury it, because the past claws its way out. Looking back now, look at this piece, I realize I've been peeking into that deserted alley for the last 26 years. A lot of our patients, our clients, are like that, right? They're still in that place where the trauma occurred. They're stuck there. They're peeking into the place where that thing happened, where their life was forever changed. So being mindful of the sensory pieces, of the way that people recall the trauma, and of the tendency to become stuck when the trauma occurred. So this is an interesting study. Anyone familiar with the ACEs study?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. This study is so important to us in understanding trauma. So what this study suggests is that trauma isn't just something people can get over. That when trauma occurs, it significantly impacts our wellness, our bodies. Right? What this research is suggesting is that perhaps trauma even changes our DNA, right? Causing a rapid deterioration of our DNA caps, leading to premature aging and disease. So as I said earlier, trauma isn't something that people just can get over. So the study, for those who aren't familiar, looked at 17,000 people. They looked at their childhood and their adolescent years, and then they looked at the adult health records. And so what they found is this: an adverse childhood experience looks at chronic, unpredictable, and stress-inducing events that happen. So that could span a broad range of things. Here's what they found. Individuals who had an ACE score had more than four or greater adverse childhood experiences were twice as likely to be diagnosed with cancer in their adult lives. That's incredible to me. People who had an ACE score of 4 were 460% more likely to suffer from depression. For women, people who had for each ACE score that a woman had, her risk of being hospitalized for an autoimmune disorder rose by 20% per ACE score. And then an ACE score of 6 or more shortens a person's lifespan by almost 20 years. This is significant. This is why we have to pay attention when someone has trauma. We have to address it. No more can we say, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to keep moving on. Because trauma gets in our cells, right? It's not just a brain thing, it's a body thing as well. So this is kind of basic, but we look at a couple different types of trauma. We look at a single episode, so people who had one event, and that event never happens again. One of the predictors they found about whether or not someone develops PTSD is how quickly is the environment returned to normal. How quickly is that environment returned to safety? So in a single episode trauma, we can assume that the environment is returned to safety pretty quickly. When someone has a single episode trauma, some of the outcomes we might see may be depression, sometimes substance use disorders, sometimes anxiety or adjustment disorders. We look at the second category, and we know a lot of our patients and clients have this experience, right? Of trauma that's complex and developmental. that went on and on and on, where the environment was never safe, where they lived in that constant sort of battle scene. These are some of the clinical outcomes that we see. We see personality disorders, right? That seems to almost go hand in hand. I looked at some research that suggested that individuals with borderline personality disorder, about 80% of them had histories of trauma. It's a pretty strong correlation. Mood disorders, eating disorders, self-harm behavior. We see a lot of cutting on the rise. Continues. It's been an epidemic for a while, and we just keep seeing more and more of it, particularly among our adolescents. Substance use disorders, people having difficulty with self-regulation, and we see a lot of compulsive disorders and process addictions. Talk a little bit about an individual that I worked with. This was kind of the clinical presentation. So I'm going to take a little poll, right? If you're a clinician and this is your person, what's the thing that stands out most? What's the thing you're going to address? It's in big, bright red letters. Ebola, right? That's the thing that caught my attention when I first looked at this case file. This individual had survived Ebola, been on a ventilator in the hospital in a coma for 10 days. I would think as a clinician that would be pretty clinically significant, right? Sure, let's go there. Here's the interesting thing, it wasn't. That wasn't the worst thing. Any guesses what was on there? You can see pet. The sexuality, somebody said pet. What else? Any other guesses? Relationship. Childhood emotional abuse and the rigid religiosity. So as a clinician, when I go in and I hear Ebola, I go, holy smokes, right? This person had Ebola, it must have been very difficult. But this is an individual who was keenly intelligent, right? Middle-aged, had become a physician, and had a passion to go and help people. And went over and during the Ebola crisis in Africa and contracted Ebola. And it was the Ebola that then began the struggles that he had. But as we looked at it and began to work, Ebola was way down at the bottom of the list. It was way down there. Mm-hmm. But what was at the top was exactly what you guys said. The childhood emotional abuse and the environment of religious rigidity and shame. That was something he carried with him. Here are some messages that he would get about himself, right, from his family. You going over and doing what you're doing in Africa is against God's will. You're putting other gods before God. You should be here. Your relationship partner doesn't deserve you. Or sorry, backwards. You don't deserve your relationship partner. You're worthless. You're hopeless. You're not serving God. Shame on you. Shame on you. Shame on you. When we looked back, that message of shame had gone on and on and on throughout your childhood. So of course, when he has questions about his sexuality, you think he's going to admit it to anybody? Heck no. Right? Because that's just more of that shame. So he began to just live with that sense of shame and being a failure. And guess what he thought Ebola was?
Punishment.
Punishment from God. Yep. And guess what his parents said? It's your punishment from God.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. If you wouldn't have gone over there, God wouldn't have needed to teach you a lesson. So when we think about trauma, we have to really understand the picture and how that works for people. What that means for them. The relationship breakup, also punishment from God. You weren't deserving of someone to love you because you weren't following what God wanted for you. So in our work together, what we began to do was really look at those early messages and begin to change some of that. Begin to recognize that that story that was told to him, that story didn't belong to him. And that he could begin to embrace a different story. That it's okay to pursue your passions and want to help people. And over time, our gentleman began to really become excited about a future and began to feel rightly angry about what happened. Often when we have people with trauma, they have a powerless sense of anger that rests within. It's incredibly destructive. Helping them express it and acknowledging it. Sometimes I say to people, you know what, if I were you, I'd be really angry too. Giving them permission to just be angry about what happened. They're not going to explode. Sometimes they're afraid, I'm going to explode, I'm going to fall apart. I'll never be back together again. So giving them permission, validating that what happened was something that's okay to be angry about. I like this quote because I think this is so true about trauma. What happens is of little significance compared to the stories we tell ourselves about what happens. Events matter little, only stories of events affect us. It's that story about what the events mean that we have to figure out. We have to know what events mean to people. And that's not to say that events aren't painful, but it's the stories that linger after that are really destructive for people. It's that low self-concept. It's the belief that they caused it. It's the belief that they were worthless. For our young man before, it was the belief that somehow he deserved Ebola. And by the way, I used to begin to joke. I would say to him, so you mean to tell me that having Ebola was easier than growing up in your childhood home? The most feared virus on the planet in your childhood was worse than that. So understanding what the events mean and what the stories are. What's the story people are telling themselves underneath? It's crucial. We have to figure that out. Trauma changes our story. Sometimes we talked about the storm earlier in the storm picture. Maybe I like storms. I don't know. This is another storm picture. However, I have to tell you, there's something behind the clouds. This is an actual picture I took on family vacation. My little boy likes to sleep in tents. So I go along and sleep in tents with him because, what fun is it to not go along? So we took a family vacation to someplace beautiful, and I took a picture of it for you. Do you like it? Right? So I took this picture because it was stunning to me how much beauty could be covered up by a storm. And sometimes when we're working with our clients, our patients, we can't see their beauty because we see the storm. Right? We see their personality disorder, we see their dysfunction, their impulsivity, their self-destruction, their anger, the way that they may poke at us, or the way that they never show up for sessions, or they're always calling us, or whatever. We see all of those things, and sometimes it's hard for us to see their resilience. Right? Any guesses what's in this picture?
Mountains.
Mountains?
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else?
Clouds.
Did you say clouds?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. See? You guys ready? I'm going to show you. The great reveal. I was standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and a storm had come through. I was standing right on the rim, perfect photo op, and that's what I saw. What was that? I felt bad for the tourists that were there that day from other countries, because that's what they saw in the Grand Canyon, right? But I think about that in terms of our clients, is that sometimes that's what people see of them, is the mess that trauma has caused and their self-destruction, and people don't really see the real them. They're lost in there, right? And yet underneath maybe this. And I find it interesting that this canyon was carved by stress and trauma and the beauty of it. There is beauty in our story and in our scars. We're not always getting there, but we can get there. I like this. I'm going to tell you another story about a young lady. But this lady's at the eye doctor, and she's got her skunk, and she says, Spoon, would you be a dear and hold my kitty while the doctor examines my eyes? Right? So Leanna was a young lady that I worked with. She was about 13 years old. Right? And parents were well-meaning, and our young lady was adopted from another country. And parents were well-meaning. They were both psychologists, and you know how we are, right? We analyze, and we kind of try to put pieces together and understand. Her parents were well-meaning. She was an only child. They gave her a lot of attention. But early on, they wanted to help her to adjust, and they wanted to be honest with her about her adoption. They just went too far. Here's some of the messages they told her early on. They said, You must feel really bad that your birth mother didn't want you. This is what they said. We understand that. We're going to connect you with some support groups so you can talk about that. So imagine a young child. She first heard that message when she was about 6 or 7 years old. We know it must be hard for you that you don't fit in. We're going to go visit the country you're from so you can feel like you fit in. This was a child that didn't speak the language of that country. She spoke English. America was her country. For her, that's where she felt like she belonged. But suddenly now, what's the message she's hearing? You don't belong with us. No one wanted you. Right? When she would act out, surprisingly she did, right? When she began to act out, parents said, you don't seem very grateful that we adopted you. Mm-hmm. You should be more grateful. Think about where you might be had we not come along. So this little young lady who was very smart, very funny, incredibly resilient, started to feel like she wasn't wanted. So by the time I saw her, she had seen umpteen million therapists. So she came in, arms crossed, a scowl on her face, and she said, I've seen a lot of therapists and I hate them all and I'll probably hate you too. I said, oh good, well it's nice to meet you. So I thought, how am I going to do this with this girl? Because parents think they've got a cat and skunk, okay? How am I going to do this? What am I going to do with this kid? So what I decided is this kid liked to draw. She loved art. Let's just do some art. I refused to talk about anything with her. Just let her draw. So we spent several sessions just drawing. She drew whales. She loved drawing whales of all shapes and sizes. So then, a couple sessions after that, she already started making eye contact. She started bringing her art book along, showing me her other drawings. Little by little, I started creeping in as I'm gaining her trust, and I said to her, what would it be like if you drew for me what your childhood's been like? Would that be okay? And she said, I'd love to. She came back the next session, and you know what she had? She had a picture of herself as a baby, wrapped up, swaddled up, her parents holding her. She was an incredible artist. And guess what? Her face was blank, and it was a dollar sign. I said, tell me about this picture. She said, it's easy. My parents paid money and got a baby. That's what I am to them. So we had to start talking more and more about what that was like for her. And this young girl wasn't going to get well at home. She wasn't. Parents would lock her in her room, and her mother would go in and force her to talk to her. So a little later, as we became more and more connected, I said to her, because this is the other thing parents told me early on, parents said, she has a dissociative identity disorder. I'm thinking, well, at 13, you don't really have a strong idea of your own identity, right? You're 13. You can pick a lot of things at 13, right? So I finally said to her, you know, your parents seem to think that you have something called a dissociative identity disorder. Do you know what that is? She said, oh yeah. I said, well, tell me, why do they think that? She said, well, because I looked it up on the internet. I wanted them to leave me alone. I was tired of my mother always hammering me. I looked it up on the internet. What are problems kids with adoptions usually have? I saw that, and I looked at the symptoms, and I started making them up. So there, right? This kid was smart. That was her resilience. How do I get my parents off my back, right? How do I fit into this place where I'm really not wanted or I'm not accepted for who I am? I can be accepted when I'm not well, when I'm other than them. So that's what she started becoming. So as we worked, she became more confident. She was hilarious, and she was actually a really well kid. So I began to affirm that with her and with her parents. There's a whole lot of normal with your daughter. There's a whole lot of normal. And over time, she began to step into that. And we got her to another place. An amazing kid. Before she left, she drew me a whale. She said, P.S. I really did like you. Good, that's good to know. So sometimes, clinically, we may think it's one thing and it's actually another. There's something underneath. There's another story underneath. So in my work as a clinician, I don't focus a whole lot on the details of what happened to someone. I used to early on. I used to think that was helpful, and what I found often is that people ended up more activated, right? More stuck in their trauma. They felt worse. I want to hear the story. I want to hear what they believe about what happened to them. I want to know what that is. So I began to help people. My main aim is I want to find their resilience. Sometimes it's hard to find, and sometimes someone just looks like a mess, and I'm thinking, where are they resilient? Let's start small and make a big deal about it, and help them stand beside their strength. And I find when we're in the wound instead of in the resilience, that people really stay stuck in the wound. Sometimes the wound is someone's identity, and they don't want to let go because it's a really powerful place. It's the only place maybe they've ever felt powerful, is being in the wound. So helping them to focus on their resilience, we can go from what happened in the past to what's happening now. How'd you get up the next day after that thing happened to you? I ask my patients this. I say, in spite of what happened to you, what were you able to accomplish? What are you most proud of? What is that thing? How'd you do that? And sometimes they'll tell me, I graduated from high school, or I finished college, I had kids, I raised beautiful children, whatever that is. There's resilience under there. There's resilience that they're even in my office, that they haven't given up, because so many people give up, don't they? They stop, they give up, they freeze, they crumble, they self-destruct. So helping them to focus on resilience also allows them to practice self-compassion. I always have clients roll their eyes at me when I talk about self-compassion. Oh, brother. Right? That's because they're confused. We have to teach our clients the difference between self-pity and self-compassion. They're entirely different things. Sometimes people think that when I'm saying self-compassion, I really mean self-pity. Well, I want to feel sorry for myself. No, it's different things. They're entirely different things. Self-pity is, for me, look what happened to me. I'm never going to get past that. Why is my life always falling apart? And self-compassion is, you know what, I went through a really hard time, and I'm deserving an opportunity to heal and recover. People can be in self-pity and self-destruct at the same time. People cannot be in self-compassion and self-destruct at the same time. The two cannot coexist. So if we can get them into self-compassion, we can reduce self-destruction. Sometimes people say, well, I don't like myself very much, I have a hard time. So I put on I call the best friend filter. Tell me about your best friend. Tell me about someone you love and you care about. They tell me about that person. If that person was having a really hard time, if they were going through what you're going through now, what would you say to them? And they have a beautiful answer, right? Because they're really good at taking care of other people most of the time. And I say, can you say that to yourselves? So the rule is, if you wouldn't say it to someone you love and care about, you can't say it to yourself any longer. So we can't expect people to have a relationship with themselves that's healthy and healing with a lot of negative dialogue going on. So there's a lot of studies about resilience. This is a big term right now. They talk about psychological resilience. There's 3 types of phenomena that they look at. So when we're talking about resilience, we talk about people who experience traumatic events, but they seem to be able to bounce back. They come back. They keep coming back from that. They recover pretty well, as opposed to other people maybe who are traumatized and don't seem to bounce back as well. And the second class that we're looking at is people who belong to a high-risk group, but have a better outcome than expected. And that might include maybe children who grew up in an alcoholic home, and they tend to fare better than other children. Because of their circumstances, we would expect them not to be as well as they are, or do as well as they are. And then thirdly, people who demonstrate positive adaptation in spite of all the stressors. They kind of blend together, but those are the 3 types of resilience that are really studied in terms of research. So I get this question a lot, how do you find resilience? We talked about this a little bit earlier. Sometimes resilience looks like a problem behavior, right? So for instance, a lot of our trauma survivors are codependent. Would you agree? They have a lot of codependency in their relationships. I see that as resilience. Here's why. That person is still willing to trust and connect in spite of how often they've been betrayed. Now, we're going to work on the codependency, but I'm going to look at that piece. This person's still trusting. This person's still open. This person's still vulnerable. We've got to get it turned in the other direction. But there's a piece of resilience under there we have to take away from that. Right? From somebody who's got a lot of anger, right? It's a person who hasn't lost their voice, a person who's still willing to advocate, a person who has a sense of injustice. Often that gets lost for people who've been traumatized. So now we have to work on rage, and we have to work on using anger appropriately. We validate anger. But that's resilience. Right? The definition of resilience is being able to return to an original state after being bent or stretched. So if we can get someone back to who they were meant to be, and honor and value that piece of them that's still kicking, that's still alive, who would you rather work with? Would you rather work with someone who's depressed and passive, or somebody who's angry and powerful? Second one, right? Yeah. I have a harder time when people are depressed and passive. I feel like they've given up sometimes. I want to get them alive. I'd like to see them get angry a little, feel some energy moving through them. I'd rather have a snarky, eye-rolling adolescent any day, right? Who's going to tell me what they think, because they're still alive and kicking. I always have this image in my head with someone like that there's been an earthquake, and all the rubble's piled on top, and days after we look for survivors, and sometimes there's a wiggling finger, right? Maybe for the adolescents, a middle finger, right? They got up in the air. I'd rather have that kind of person. That's resilience, right? It's big, it's overblown, but holy smokes, they're still holding on. I can work with that. That's what I'm looking for. What does the spark look like? Where's it at? Let's find it. Resilience lives in the wound. We have to go to the wound. We don't want to stay in the wound. But we have to understand the wound and what the event or events meant to that person. We have to be brave enough to walk in there. And then really, as I said, recognizing and honoring resilience. I like to use humor a lot with people, right? If I can get them to laugh with me, begin to have a little humor around their defenses, pretty soon those defenses are down and gone. So if I have an eye-rolling adolescent, I go along with it. All right, get your eye roll ready. I'm going to tell you something that's really going to make you mad. And then we have a laugh. Then they can't really roll their eyes anymore successfully, can they? So using some humor with them helps, but really honoring this person survived. I tell people, look, this is hard work, but you're bigger and stronger than the thing that tried to take you down. You're still here. Right? Let's work with that. You can get better from there. Any question? Any idea who this is? This person was born into abject poverty in rural Mississippi in the U.S. Teenage mother.
Maya Angelou.
Raised. Did you say Maya Angelou?
Yeah.
Any other guesses?
Elvis.
Huh?
Oprah.
Oprah. Yep. It's Oprah. This was her childhood. Right? This was Oprah. I didn't know about the infant son dying shortly after birth, but that truly happened to her. And she suffered sexual assault by several men during her childhood. But this woman, look what she's accomplished. Now, we may not maybe everyone likes Oprah, right? But I can appreciate how this woman survived and what she's overcome. Sometimes we imagine that people who are successful were just like, came out of the womb and they're just a booming success from the second they were born, right? She really fought her way up to the top, right? I can respect this. So how did she survive that? I did a little more research because I was curious about her. So she had an early life relationship with a grandparent who was solid, who was caring in her life. And she had some exposure to some religion and some concept about what values are, what things meant to her. So that when things started going wrong for her, she could identify in some ways that that thing was wrong. And then she had her father intervened in her life and gave her some support and structure and safety, took her out of the environment that was really traumatic for her. And she got some opportunities. She started doing some work, some journalism, some broadcasting that she liked. And this is what she took away from her experiences. She helps people who suffer. She's got a passion to provide education for women in poverty. This is what resilience can look like for people, that we can grow from our experiences. Another example of resilience. I like this idea. You are not your abuse. You are not what they did to you. You are not your trauma. You are the cleverness that survived. You are the courage that escaped. You are the power that hid and protected a tiny spark of your light. You will fan that spark into a bonfire of rage and love, and with it you will burn all their lies to ash. Isn't that powerful?
What's that by?
You know, it's unknown. Yep, I tried to find the source. Yeah. But I like this concept and this idea, right? This is how we capture resilience for people. Because trauma's not pretty. It's not a flowery walk through a garden, right? It's hard. It's really, really hard. And people don't often want to walk through this because they feel like they're going to fall apart. But this is empowering. I really like that second verse, right? That's really looking at the resilience. You're the cleverness that survived, the courage that escaped. Those are the pieces that we have to find in our clients as we're working with them. So we talked about this already. So this is a little resilience assessment that I like to do. If I'm having trouble having someone find their resilience, this is something we looked at. I ask these questions when they're talking about it, they're telling their story. Well, tell me how you survived. What did you do? How did you get through that? I start listening, try to find areas of resilience and pull them out and mention them and talk about them and honor them. What did you tell yourself that let you get up again and again and again? I was recently working with an older gentleman, and from a young age, he had to sleep with a knife under his pillow, right? Because his mother married a man that was incredibly abusive, and he was afraid of that man. So he started sleeping with a knife under his pillow. He started fighting back, protecting his brother, because the stepfather would go after his brother a lot. And I said, well, tell me about yourself as a kid. He said, I was really rebellious. So I'm going to just change that word out when I reframe it. I said, yeah, I hear that you were really angry. I probably would have been angry too. That sounds really hard. That was his resilience that fought back. Right? And this man covered in tattoos in my office with a bandana, looking like a biker, was weeping about what that was like for him as a child, to be afraid all the time. And he survived, and as an adult, he started working in the recovery field because he wanted to help people. That's his resilience. And so taking time to honor that helped him begin to step away from this concept that he was bad or that he was wrong or that he was a failure. I asked people, what were you able to do in the midst of your pain? How did you do that? How did you figure that out? How did you know to do that? What emboldened that man to sleep with a knife under his pillow as a child? Right? Other kids may not have. Other kids may have cowered in a corner. Other kids may not have protected their brothers. How did you do that in the middle of all your pain? And then what kept you motivated to survive? Sometimes I like to ask people, how do you see yourself in 5 years? If your story about your success were to be written in a newspaper 5 years from now, in a news article, what would they say about you in terms of how you survived? Tell me. And I like to think about resilience in spite of our trauma and because of our trauma. Both are really crucial. And because of our trauma, enables them to see the beauty in the storm, to begin to have some appreciation for what they experienced. What does your survival mean to you? How are you different? How are you more kind? How are you more compassionate toward other people because of what you've been through? How are you stronger? What did you learn about yourself? How did you forgive? These are really important questions in restructuring that negative dialogue inside and changing their story. Here's what I want to happen. I want to put the pen in their hands when they leave, right? The metaphorical pen, so they can write their own story. They didn't get to choose what happened before, but they get to choose now. They're not powerless over the capacity for change. They can begin to change. Write a different story about yourself. How would it be written if you could succeed? I tell people, look, your story is going to be told one way or the other by future generations. You get to decide what the words say. You get to choose. Does the story tell of your destruction, or does the story tell of you rising again? You get to choose that. How do you want your children to speak of you down the road? You get to choose that. Empowering them after trauma is so important. People hate this, by the way. Just a warning. I get eye rolls on this one too. I like to talk about integrity for people because often they feel like they don't have any, especially, sometimes what I find when people have been in self-destruct mode is they can't separate what was done to them from what they've done to themselves. And they feel like they don't have a right to talk about the things that were done to them or the things that happened to them because they've done so much destruction in their own life. So helping them figure out maybe how trauma violated boundaries or their sense of what happened or what was right or wrong, and how they begin to choose differently, and recognizing what matters to me, what's important. I do a values clarification with trauma survivors. What do you value? Right? How did trauma impact that? How do your choices impact that? What do you do moving forward? But it's important for them to understand what their values are. Often they don't have a sense of themselves. I find that trauma survivors are great about knowing what everybody else needs, right? They could walk in this room, they could figure out who's tired, who's having a bad day, who's distressed, who's mad at who, right? Who needs a hug, who needs help with something. They have that radar that's finely tuned, right? That they developed in that kind of traumatic environment. But they don't have a clue what they want, what they think, what they need, what they feel. They're just kind of numb and checked out. So helping them understand their values and exploring the concept of integrity, exploring the idea of an identity of wellness rather than an identity of illness. What does it look like if I'm well? How can I be powerful and in recovery at the same time? And then celebrate those tiny steps toward resilience and recovery. Really embrace them, make a big deal out of them, right? Celebrate them. So we do a lot of different things, and I try to be kind of eclectic. People say, well, what model do you use? And I don't really adhere to a model. I pull from a lot of different ones. I try to figure out where people are. We use a lot of DBT in the States. It's powerful. We get people with self-harm and trauma. It's great for helping people with regulation. It doesn't work for everybody, right? So that might not be a model I use for everybody. I've worked with a lot of adolescents who've been through very structured DBT programs and come out cutting more than ever. And they can teach me DBT. So that might not, it's true, but that might not always be the best modality for everybody. For others, it's a lifesaver. So I have to figure out what works for people. I have to figure out what they're interested in, like our young lady was talking about earlier who liked art and liked to draw whales. That's where I started from. Let's draw. So we use a lot of narrative therapy, helping people look at their story and telling it differently. And I use a lot of art therapy. I like to use a lot of collage because sometimes people can find images, and those images can be much more powerful than the words. And maybe they don't have words yet. Right? But I've had people really collage a lot, and that becomes the beginning of their story. And sometimes they really get into it and want to collage more and more. We use a lot of movement therapy too. We also use a lot of somatic experiencing, right? Helping people sort of reconnect and learn to discharge some of the trauma from their bodies. Use a lot of yoga and Tai Chi and Shin Song, helping people get in touch with their bodies again. People often abandon themselves in the heat of trauma, particularly with sexual trauma. People don't want to be in their bodies. It's too frightening. So So teaching them how to be safe with themselves and back in their own bodies is really important. So there's a lot of different approaches to trauma. Sometimes when people come in, if they're in treatment, and maybe if you're working for a treatment program, you get this. I'm here to do trauma work. I'm ready. Let's do trauma work. Let's go. When am I going to get my EMDR? So it's a process, right? Trauma recovery is a process, and we have to slow it down. Sometimes people aren't ready to do trauma work. I had a young lady come in, and she had been raped the week before, and parents got her right into treatment. Do you think she was ready to talk about that rape? No. Her central nervous system was so activated. She needed to be in a safe spot for a while, and her body needed to know she was safe. That's where trauma work started. So trauma work can look like a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily mean I sit down and pull up my story right away. It's getting a structure in place where people can be safe. I have a safety contract when I'm working with people with trauma. If they're engaging in self-harm, we're not doing trauma work, right? Because they're still in the trauma mode. They're still traumatizing themselves through self-harm. We're not going to do trauma work. So when people are really motivated to do trauma, it really helps with establishing that contract for self-harm. Same with an eating disorder. If they're in binging and purging, if they're restricting, we're not in a place where we can do trauma work yet. We got to get safe. Okay? We always have to be safe. Safety is first.
Do you say that?
I absolutely do. Yep. Yeah. She asked if I tell them that, and I said yes. It's definitely something we talk about. Teaching them to be safe with themselves and to have respect for themselves goes a very long way in their healing. Right? Because often they don't know how to be safe for themselves. They end up being with people who aren't safe with them either. So starting that expectation that we're going to be safe, and that's where we're going to start. So one of the things I really work for is finding meaning. We talked about that a lot earlier, but I ask people to really think about that. What did it mean to you to go through what you've been through? People say, what do you mean? What did it mean? It was terrible. It was horrible. It was the worst thing. How dare you ask me that? Right? What else did it mean to you? What does it mean to you now? What does it mean to you to get well? Right? How do you tell your story differently? So finding meaning. If they don't find meaning, they're going to stay stuck. And it doesn't happen overnight. So it's a grueling process. It's walking through really hard things. We got to find meaning. We talked about some of those others already. Anyone read Little Bee? Chris Cleave? Yeah, one? That's another hard story. Oh no, I like these hard stories. So Little Bee is the story of a Nigerian refugee. Right? She had experienced some significant trauma in her life back in Nigeria. And she ends up in sort of a camp for refugees in the UK. And when she comes, she's very smart. She doesn't speak English, so she learns to speak what she calls the Queen's English. And in doing so, it forms a protection for her while she's in this internment camp against the men, because the men were traumatizing the women in the camps. So she learns, if I'm bright and intelligent, it's a way to protect myself. So she's getting released from here, and she's in line. And this quote to me is really powerful about the idea of resilience. She says, on the girl's brown legs, she's standing in line in the queue waiting to be released. She says, on the girl's brown legs, there were many small white scars. I was thinking, do those scars cover the whole of you like the stars and the moons on your dress? I thought that would be pretty too, and I ask you right here, please, to agree with me that a scar is never ugly. That is what the scar makers want us to think. But you and I, we must make an agreement to defy them, okay? We must see all scars as beauty. This will be our secret, because take it from me, a scar does not form on the dying. A scar means I survived. In a few breaths' time, I will speak some sad words to you, but you must hear them as we have agreed to see scars now. Sad words are just another beauty. A sad story means this storyteller is alive. The next thing you know, something fine will happen to her, something marvelous, and then she will turn around and smile. I love this idea that scars don't form on the dying, that there's a beauty, a certain beauty. It's rugged, right? Sometimes it's hard to look at, but there's a beauty in scars. And we've got to work to see that and help our clients see that too in their recovery. Not just staying in the wounding of trauma, but staying in the healing and in the light. appreciate you guys being with me today. Any questions? I thought I'd open the floor. Yeah.
How do you handle pre-verbal trauma in your experience?
How do I handle pre-verbal trauma? Sometimes with pre-verbal, as you know, they don't have clear memories, but you know and they know that something happened. I don't dig around to try and unearth what it might have been, but I go with as if it had happened. And what does that mean to them to know? How do they then live moving forward with the knowledge that something might have happened to them? In much the same way, but just not getting into trying to figure out or recovering memories they may not have. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
In your experience, how much difference does it make at what age these things happen?
I think it makes a lot of difference, and sort of understanding developmentally where people were when the trauma occurred helps me understand where they might be stuck. So I think it's really crucial to understand what age someone was at. Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks. Yeah.
I've got a client that doesn't want to, I've got a client that doesn't want to look at her history at all. She said that she's had like 6 different therapists.
Uh-huh.
She's been there, done that. No, thank you.
Yes.
Let's talk about here and now, please.
Mm-hmm.
Would this be quite a good way to sort of get her to move forward and actually talk to me about this stuff?
Yes, definitely. I hear that a lot from people sometimes. I've already dealt with that. I talked about that. It's over and done. I don't push, but I kind of sneak my way in. Yep, I think it's important to kind of go back and revisit, because if they're in self-destruction, then you know that that trauma's still alive and well. Yeah.
How would you handle like night terrors or dreams or anything like sleep problems?
Sleep problems. I like to make sure I'm working with a good psychiatrist, because sometimes some of that can be treated with different medications for PTSD. So I like to make sure that that's happening. But I also normalize that as an experience, and I try not to give that a lot of energy where that becomes a fearful thing, because I think the more fearful they are, the more likely they are to have more night terrors the next day. But if I normalize that as their body and their brain are working together to try and make sense of what happened. Yeah, and giving them coping skills too. There's a couple of really good CDs on meditation, relaxation, and sleep that can be helpful too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you say something about EMDR? Because I'm sure a lot of us here have sort of been told so many times or heard it said that EMDR is the thing.
Is the key? Yes. Yes.
And I've done some work with Heather Kura's CBT for post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, she says, well, she finds CBT best. I just wondered what your views on that.
Yes, I actually appreciate both EMDR and CBT. I'm always cautious if someone says this is the magic key, because I don't know that there's a magic key that's going to fit for everyone. I've had people really benefit from EMDR, and they've been able to make miles of progress in one session. I've had other people that EMDR is too activating and they're not stable enough, or it didn't fit for them, or they didn't connect. EMDR is a really powerful tool, and I agree that it's very helpful for trauma. It's helpful too where maybe there are limited resources for trauma, and you can help kind of encapsulate some of those events in one session. But it's not the be-all, end-all, in my opinion. I appreciate CBT, and I do a lot of that just sort of in restructuring those negative cognitions. But again, it doesn't work for everyone. People who are highly intellectual, CBT is great, but I find they don't connect. They just kind of stay up here doing therapy. So I try to find connections between heart and head. Yeah. So I may blend a lot of different things together. Yeah. Yes.
How do you factor in cultural differences?
That's another good question. Well, at Cottonwood, we have a lot of folks coming from different cultures, including over here in Europe and the UK, and I try to honor where people are too. I've had several patients from London say, well, and they don't know how they feel about feeling, and so we, sorry, no offense, but it's difficult for them, and it might be really a clash with how they've been taught, or some folks see emotion as a weakness. So I try to respect that and go in the road that they're heading. Yes?
More non-European cultural differences, like Asian, African, where we've got a lot of trauma coming over from there now.
Yeah, they're
cultural beliefs and identities that come with that, challenging like Western European ideologies that we use and ways of treating people.
Yes, yes. Well, and if I don't know much about a person's culture, I ask them to tell me and what that means and what does that symbolize. What do you believe about these things? Because I don't want to just go marching blindly in with my ideas about how they heal. And it's important for me to understand how they heal. Interesting, I've worked a lot with some of our Native American cultures in the U.S., and they have very different beliefs. Sometimes we've had some different ceremonies and things that kind of help them heal that go along with their traditions. So I try to be as creative as possible, but really let them be my teacher about how that works for them. Yeah. Other questions?
Are the slides available?
I believe so. I believe they can be made available, the slides. Yes? Okay, yes. All right. Yes.
I just wondered if you had a view on clients who come in who are still using drugs or alcohol recreationally, not in the more kind of chaotic sense, which I take as being the traumatic acting out that you were talking about, possibly.
Right.
But some people may be using kind of recreationally. I wonder if you had a sort of view or a thought around that.
That's a really good question. My view about substance use when you're recovering from trauma is that the brain's not going to heal where there's an environment of substance use. Introducing those chemicals into the brain or numbing emotions sometimes can be a barrier for recovery. I do ask that people be sober while they're doing trauma work, just because I think it's a way to honor. Research says too, when people are using substances, they're more likely to be re-traumatized, and then that pattern just continues. So I really try to encourage sobriety, and not everyone's an addict or an alcoholic, and so I can respect that maybe somebody can have a glass of wine and be okay. But I do ask for sobriety during that time that they're working, just because I think it aids to an environment where they're going to heal more quickly, be more available for their own healing. Yeah. Other questions?
I was curious about, you said the research that has been done.
Welcome to my world.
Okay, the research that you said has been done, I wasn't sure if what you then said was as a result of that research or if there's more information on that research. And when you put it up there, I was thinking specifically of World War II survivors who then go on to survive a long time, and now we learn their stories, and it seems like there are great sources of resilience around.
Right.
Just curious to know more.
Yeah, that particular study that we looked at pertained more to the adverse childhood experiences versus people who may have survived like a war in their adult years. I think when people have had pretty stable upbringings where there wasn't traumatic events, they tend to fare better when they have an adult trauma than people who've had multiple childhood traumas and then later adult traumas. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was curious to know about both actually.
Yep.
It's just the World War II was one thing, but yeah, the childhood trauma too, and is there more information on how those people survive and are resilient, I guess?
Yeah, I would be interested to research that a little in terms of war survivors long term. I think in terms of our world today that we're seeing greater and greater levels of stress and trauma, and so I'm curious to see what that impact will look like and how we adapt to that moving forward. Yeah. Other questions? One back here?
When you were talking about the genetic transference of trauma,
Yes.
was that related to the paper that was written about Holocaust survivors of it recently?
Yes, yeah, yeah. It's that epigenetic inheritance theory
Yes.
that's out there, which is really interesting, yeah. Any other questions? Well, I have no concept of time. I don't have my watch on, and I'm jet lagged, so I feel comfortable in wrapping it up today. Thank you so much for sharing this morning.